Hey there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Bible in Life podcast. My name is John Whitaker, and I am the host and creator of the Bible in Life, and I am really grateful for you and grateful for this podcast and the opportunity we have to be together like this, just to think about things that I think are important and helpful to both our life and to understanding the Bible. And bringing those two things together, the Bible and our life. So that's really the heart behind all of this. As I say, pretty much on every episode, my goal is to provide what I like to call blue jeans theology, by which I mean Bible teaching that is in the language of everyday life and rooted in the context of everyday life so that we can follow Jesus right in the midst of our everyday life. So glad you're here. And on this episode, we are going to begin a new series, maybe a little bit different than things we have done in the past. I want to begin a series where it's a little bit more about the Bible than looking at the Bible itself. A little bit of background, a little bit of history, a little bit of story, specifically about the Gospels. If you have ever read the Gospels and wondered, why are they upset about the fact that the disciples are picking heads of grain on the Sabbath? Why in the world are the disciples picking heads of grain from someone else's grain field on the Sabbath? Or if you've wondered why there are phrases like reclining at table, and what does that mean and what does that imply? If you're wondering how, for example, Jesus can be reclining at table with people and all of a sudden a woman from town who is a notorious sinner could all of a sudden break into where he's reclining at table and be at his feet. Or if you listen to some of the things that Jesus says and the debates he enters into in the Gospels, debates about the resurrection, marriage in the resurrection, or you wonder about some of the characters, like if you're reading the Old Testament, then you turn your page from Malachi to Matthew, and all of a sudden you're meeting people that are like Pharisees, Sadducees. Who are those guys? And where did they come from? All these kinds of questions have to do with the history, the world of the Bible. So I want to begin a series on this episode that just for the next handful of weeks will actually look at some of the historical aspects of the Gospels, not just so that we can have more information or be smarter about that stuff. That's never really the goal. We want to grasp the information, but in this case, my real goal is to help us get to know Jesus through the real world of the Gospels. So I want to begin a series here for the next handful of weeks just on the world of the Gospels with that aim in mind, helping us understand Jesus more, understanding what Jesus meant, because the fact is, Jesus was not a 21st century American or a 21st century Canadian or a 21st century South African, wherever you're listening at. Jesus didn't grow up in our world. Jesus didn't wrestle with our questions. He didn't interact with our issues and our debates. He didn't directly answer any of your questions per se. It doesn't mean what he had to say or that his ministry has nothing pertinent to say to your life. But if we're going to hear and hear accurately what he does say to our life, we have to hear him on his terms in his world. And so for the next handful of weeks, I just want to wrestle with the world of the Gospels to help us understand Jesus and get to know Jesus a little bit more. Now, before we even begin that, we should answer real briefly the question, what's a gospel? When we talk about the real world of the Gospels, what are we talking about? Which books of the Bible, if you're not super familiar with the Bible, and what actually is a gospel? I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this here, but if you go to the listener's commentary, you'll see there's a whole series of recordings sort of giving a background to the Gospels, and one of those actually answers that question, what's a gospel? But we're talking about the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first 4 books of the New Testament. That's where the New Testament begins. And these 4 books tell the story of Jesus from his early life, a couple of them at least mention his birth, all the way up to his death, burial, and resurrection. These are the Gospels. And the word gospel simply means good news, and it was used in the world of Jesus' day oftentimes for events that brought good things to the empire or to the realm. In fact, one of the ways it was used was for even like political things. So the birthday of Caesar Augustus is heralded as a gospel story, a good news in the Roman Empire. And so when we talk about the Gospels, they have all sorts of social and political as well as theological overtones. Here is God's good news. Here is God's gospel, and it's not announcing the birth of the emperor. It's announcing the birth and the life and the death of God's king, the Messiah. That's the Gospels. That's what they're attempting to do is in their own way, by means of biography about Jesus, although a very special kind of biography and a very select biography. They don't tell all of his life. In fact, like the Gospel of John only really hits about 6 or 7 key weeks out of Jesus' ministry. So they're very selective, but by telling stories about Jesus, they're announcing that he is God's royal king, God's royal son, and the one who is truly in charge of the world. That's the Gospels. And by the way, just for those of you who love history, like details and dates, we don't know the exact precise dates of Jesus' life because the dating methods used in the Gospels that were common in the Greco-Roman world are a little less precise than the way we date things. But Jesus was born before Herod the Great died. Herod the Great died, we know from secular history, around 4 BC. So Jesus is actually born in maybe 4 or 5 BC. And then Jesus' death, according to most scholars, there are 2 really main options. It either happened in the year 30 AD or 33 AD, somewhere in there. That's the rough time period of Jesus' life. And he was born in the land of Israel. And we'll talk about that here in a future episode, during the reign of the Roman Empire. And we'll talk about that in a future episode as well. But for today, what I want to do is just give a little bit of history and backstory to the gospel and to the life of Jesus, because I think it's really important. When we open our Bible to the New Testament, we start with the book of Matthew, and we're going to read through the whole New Testament. We need to understand that it's like starting a movie 75% of the way in, that we're in the middle of a story. And that story didn't begin in Matthew. It began way back in what we call the Old Testament. And the roots of Jesus' life, Jesus' teaching, a lot of the issues that Jesus engages with his contemporaries have their roots in that Old Testament story. And we just have to realize that if we're going to understand this part of the story, we got to get the beginning of the story in the Old Testament. And so we need to have some basic grasp of that story and what that story was about. And so as you read through the Old Testament, you get the creation account in Genesis 1 through 3. You get the fall of man in Genesis 3. And then picking up in Genesis chapter 12, we begin to see how is God going to solve the problem of sin and death that is now plaguing his good world. So God made a good world. Humans broke faith with their creator, unleashed sin and death into the world. How is God going to solve that? And beginning in Genesis chapter 12, we get that story, and God does it in, again, maybe a very different way than we would expect. He does it by calling a human a specific man who lived in a specific time and a specific place, and God meets him where he's at, and he's going to work with that human, and that human's name is Abram, or we might know him better as Abraham. God changes his name to Abraham a little bit later. And Abraham is the founding patriarch, the great patriarch of the Jewish people, of whom Jesus is a part. The basic kind of flow of the Old Testament story leading up to Jesus goes Abraham to Isaac, to Jacob, to the people of Israel, and then through the long history of Israel that culminates in the person of Jesus that we meet in the Gospels. And so that's sort of the flow. And what we have to understand is that God makes a promise to Abraham in Genesis 12 that gets restated multiple times throughout the book of Genesis. But the promise is that God will be his God, and that God will bless him, and that Abraham is going to inherit land, and he is going to have a long and great lineage of descendants. Now, when God makes that promise, Abraham doesn't have any kids. He and his wife are getting on in years, and Abraham has been called out of his own city. So he has neither land nor lineage nor heir, and God makes this promise to him. And Abraham trusts God's promise and follows him. And what you see in the Abraham story in the Old Testament is just Abraham learning more and more who God is and what it means to trust him. Well, that promise then is eventually passed on to Abraham's son Isaac. He is the child of promise. And then Isaac passes on that promise to Jacob, or God passes on that promise through Isaac to Jacob. And then Jacob's sons become the patriarchs, the 12 tribes of Israel. And then you get the whole nation of Israel, originally a loose collection of tribes. They become a covenant nation at Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus 19 and 20. And then you watch Israel's history throughout the whole of the Old Testament as Israel fails repeatedly to be faithful to the covenant, faithful to their God. Yes, there's a faithful remnant, but the nation as a whole is infected with the same disease as the rest of human race, and they are sinful and disloyal to Yahweh, their covenant God, and that eventually leads to exile. Now, that's obviously super high-level overview of this story. But that promised Abraham through Isaac to Jacob down through Israel is what's culminated in the person of Jesus. Not only that, we have to understand that the Old Testament ends with Israel having gone into exile, the northern kingdom, because Israel splits into two. You have a north and a south. And the northern kingdom, which typically in the later Old Testament goes by Israel, it was taken captive by the superpower of Assyria. And then a little over 100 years later, the southern kingdom of Judah was taken captive by the Babylonians and went into exile. And then they return from exile, and they rebuild Jerusalem, and they rebuild the temple, and then your Old Testament ends. And when your Old Testament ends in the book, at least the way our English Bible structured, the book of Malachi, when it ends in Malachi, from Malachi to Matthew, there are 400 years. And during those 400 years, even though the Jews have returned from exile, they are under foreign occupation. So the Persians defeated the Babylonians. They allowed the Jews to return home. The Greeks defeated the Persians and spread Greek culture all throughout the region. The Romans eventually defeated the Greeks and the remnants of Alexander the Great's empire that affected all of Jewish history. And for those 400 years between Malachi and Matthew, there's been a lot of history for the Jews. And that history, 400 years of history, has led to a lot of the political and socio-cultural issues that shape the nature of the Gospels. So, for example, the Pharisees. You read your Old Testament, you never hear about the Pharisees. But then all of a sudden in Matthew and the gospel stories, there's the Pharisees. When you read your Old Testament, you never hear about the Sadducees. But when you read your Old Testament, Jesus is interacting with the Sadducees. He's interacting with Roman centurions. Why? Because of this 400 years of history from Malachi to Matthew. And during that time period, while all of this is going on and the Jews are under foreign occupation, so they're living in their land, they've rebuilt their temple, and yet, in one sense, the exile is ended. They've come back home. In another sense, for the Jews, the exile isn't over. They're still under foreign occupation, and God's Shekinah glory has never returned to the temple. And so the temple seems empty of God's presence, and the fullness of all of God's promises haven't happened. Yes, we're no longer under Babylonian captivity, but we're still under foreign occupation. And the Romans, by the time we get to Jesus' day, they're not nice people. And their foreign policy is we will put down any threat to our order, to our peace, to our stability, and to our rule with violence. And they were good at it. And so here you have this Jewish people in Jesus' day wondering, God, where in the world are you? Like, we have been waiting for centuries. We have tried to be faithful, and you have all these various groups trying to be faithful, thinking if they could just be faithful enough, maybe God would finally fulfill his promise to Abraham, and maybe he would finally kick out the Romans. Some have taken matters into their own hands and tried to kick out the Romans on their own during these 400 years of intervening time period and kick out the foreign occupiers, right? And even during the decades of Jesus' life, you have all sorts of people that claim to be the Messiah who are trying to rise up a revolution and get rid of the Romans. And all of that is the culmination of centuries of looking and waiting and longing. And when we finally arrive at the book of Matthew, Jesus is born into this world under foreign occupation, foreign rule, which meant, as we'll talk about in future episodes, pagan religion, pagan icons all throughout the land. It meant Jews hoping, longing, praying, wondering, when is God going to show up? When is God going to fulfill all his great promises? When is he going to bring in the golden age that was promised in the prophets like Isaiah and Micah? When is that going to happen? When is he going to raise up his great king? What will that even look like? The Jews are wondering all these sorts of questions, and they have all sorts of ideas about that have shaped the world into which Jesus is born. And it's into this world, complete with Roman soldiers and Roman swords and Roman spears and Roman taxes and the threat of Roman destruction and Roman execution. All of that. It's into that world that Jesus is born. It's into the world of great angst, some despair, some feeling like maybe God has abandoned them, some still praying and longing and waiting and watching and wondering. People wondering, where have all the prophets gone? That question gets asked in some of the books written between Malachi and Matthew that just share the history of the Jews. And they ask the question, where have all the prophets gone? Why? Because the prophetic word is gone, and it seems like God isn't acting anymore, and the people are wondering what in the world is going on, and where is God in the midst of all that? And into this small little village out in the hills outside of Jerusalem, in what is effectively the backwaters of the Roman Empire, to a poor couple. We know Mary and Joseph are poor because they offer the poor person sacrifice to celebrate Jesus' birth of birds, not sheep, goats, or bulls, but birds, so they're poor. So to a poor family in the backwaters of the Roman Empire, this little baby is born. And it's in that world that Jesus grows up. And I just think that's so important for us. Now, that's, again, very high level, quick overview. We'll look at some of the details of what Roman occupation meant, who were the Pharisees and Sadducees, what was the religious life like among the Jews, and what were some of the religious debates. In the next few weeks, we'll look at some of those details. I just wanted to give you a high-level overview of the biblical story culminating in this 400-year period between the Testaments. But it's what I think is so significant about that is sometimes it feels to us that God is distant, far off, unremoved. And yet, what the life of Jesus reminds us of is God enters into the real world. And yes, that means that when we read our Bible, it feels foreign to us. When we go clear back to Abraham, it just feels like a totally different world where things are weird and strange and we don't fully get it, right? It means we're going to have to do some historical work and some language work and some culture work to understand Jesus and the Gospels. But at the same time, it's also a massive blessing to know that God gets our world and He's not afraid of interacting into our world and speaking into our world. And that's who Jesus is. And so when you read about Jesus and you read the teachings of Jesus, if it ever feels weird to you or if it's like, why is he talking about that? Well, that's part of the reason why. And what that means is, as readers of the life of Jesus, we have to hear Jesus on his terms. We can't take what Jesus says and immediately turn it into something about our life or our world or our culture because his world was different. We're going to have to hear him on his terms and try to understand what he's talking about in his culture. What was the historical issue? What was the historical question? Why were they debating this? What were the various opinions on it? Why do they say things the way they do? But all of that is because God enters into the real world. That's what the incarnation means. The word incarnation refers to the taking on of flesh. When we say that God became flesh and dwelt among us, we're talking about the incarnation. And God did that in a Jewish world occupied by Roman military and Roman government, dealing with all sorts of political and cultural and religious issues of their day. And so we meet people we know from history. Caesar Augustus, also known as Octavian, the adopted nephew of Julius Caesar, who consolidated the empire after the Roman Civil War that ensued from the assassination of Julius Caesar. We meet another emperor of Rome, Tiberius Caesar. We meet Herod the Great and Herod Antipas. We meet Pontius Pilate. These are all Romans or client kings of the Romans who ruled in this time period. And we know bits and pieces about them from history. We know who they're real people. We can study them and we can learn about them. We meet other Jewish people we know from history, like Joseph Caiaphas, who was involved in Jesus' trial and execution as high priest. We know some things about him and his family, and even about his royal tomb. And we actually have a verified artifact from history that appears to be the ossuary, that is the bone box for Caiaphas, the high priest at Jesus' trial and execution. We know these people. Why? Because this is the real world of history, where God chose to enter as a person, as a Jewish baby who grew up as a Jewish boy in a Jewish home, in a Jewish world, wrestling with Jewish questions because of foreign occupation and God's seeming silence and absence for 400 years. And so, while it at times is difficult and strange to us, I think it's also a massive blessing to us. This happened in the real world. And God has always been one who has worked in the real world. And this struck me one day as I was sitting in a chapel service at Boise Bible College, where I taught for a long time. We were in the midst of a building project to build a new chapel. We we're sitting in a gym with very pedestrian setting, right, on rickety old folding chairs with a black curtain behind us to make the room feel smaller, on a stage with dilapidated carpet because it needed to be updated, all while we were in the midst of a renovation and building of a new chapel. And I'm looking around thinking, this is perfect. Here we are singing songs to the great God of heaven, and he enters into less than ideal spaces. He works in the real world of time and space with real people, where things aren't always beautiful and clean and perfect and shiny. That's what the incarnation is about, and that's the world that Jesus entered into. And so over the next handful of weeks, I just want to explore some bits and pieces of that world and look at a few of the details, and then maybe look at some of the passages where those details come to life and it helps us get to know Jesus a little bit more so that we can hear Jesus well, understand what he meant, so that we can then begin to live out the life that Jesus calls us to in our very own real world, so that Jesus can reproduce in us his kingdom, that his will can be done in and through us as he taught us to pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth in the real world of space and time as it is in heaven. All right, thanks for tuning into this episode of the Bible in Life podcast. I pray that this week, as you go about your real life in a real world with a real job, with real neighbors in a real neighborhood, with real kids that you're parenting, and all that goes with that, you will invite Jesus into it and let him shape your life right where you live every day. God bless you. I look forward to talking with you again next week.